Hi, everyone. We're back with a special edition of Fertility Docs Uncensored. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Abby Eblen from Nashville Fertility Center, and today I'm joined by my spunky and spirited co-host, Dr. Susan Hudson from Texas Fertility Center,
Hello.
and Dr. Carrie Bedient from the Fertility Center of Las Vegas.
Hey.
And we have a very special guest, and we're very honored to have her. Her name is Rebecca O'Connor. She is an attorney. She is the director of the Center for Policy and Leadership at the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. And she is here today to discuss a really important topic, and that's the Alabama decision. But first, Becca, and you go by Becca, I know. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to the position you're in right now.
Sure. First, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. So I am a patient turned advocate in this space. I have worked for a couple decades in the advocacy world. I've been an advocate on behalf of victims of crime, including sexual and domestic violence. And after my own experience with my husband going through IVF to conceive our twin daughters, which are twin tornadoes. I recognize, just how much struggle others are going through and wanted to be part of the vocal chorus in support of assisted reproductive medicine. And so I joined ASRM in 2020 as their director of government affairs, and was in that role for a couple of years before I took a little side journey and then returned to ASRM again because I just can't put down this fight as the director of the CPL.
Well, it's great to have people like you helping fight the fight because as we've seen, we've got some fighting to do.
Absolutely.
We do. And so could you start out, Becca, and just explain the Alabama court decision for those of us who are not attorneys? And, on the news, they sort of jumped to like what the final decision was. And I think a lot of people,
a little information.
What was the background? Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the background.
Yeah, it's a wild fact pattern. And for anyone paying attention, you're not wrong to be confused. We have a situation where three families back a couple of years back were patients at a clinic in Alabama. They had success with IVF and built their families, but had extra embryos, which is part and parcel, part of the process of doing IVF, and they elected to freeze those. The cryo bank where they were stored, the facility, is adjacent to the clinic in a hospital. And one of the patients from that hospital, unrelated to the clinic, etc., wandered into the lab in a sort of freak occurrence and decided to open the freezer and put his hand in and pull out a sleeve containing embryos from these couples. And not surprisingly, was burned by the
nitrogen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Dropped it on the ground and destroyed the embryos. And so they sued, the family sued, looking for compensation under traditional claims of negligence and whatnot. But there was also a claim as sort of a backup. If we don't prevail on traditional negligence claims, we also want to raise a claim under the Alabama wrongful death of a minor child statute, which harkens back to 1857. I could be wrong. It could be 1855, but you get the gist. Yes.
I want to pause for just a second here because hearing this alone, I can already hear the questions of our listeners. In pretty much every IVF lab, all the embryos are behind several layers of locks and people. And so when Becca says freak accident, this is truly a freak accident. Like when I think about how you would have to get into an IVF lab, I mean, that's at least 3 sets of locks that you have to get through. And so this is really and truly a freak accident. So sorry to interrupt you. Please.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I appreciate that. And so they brought this claim under this ancient and these wrongful death act. And traditionally, under Alabama law, that act has been, and when they drafted it, they talked about this and they said this only applies to children that are in utero, so already gestating in the womb, or post-birth, basically, living children. And a rogue court, if you will, of of folks with very strong opinions, rooted in theology and their own sort of thinking. In this instance, the appeals court disagreed with the lower court's decision that the Wrongful Death Act doesn't apply. So it was dismissed at the lower level. They were like, no, of course, this is not a case of wrongful death. And so when they appealed, they were successful because the all Republican and elected judges of the Supreme Court, 7-9, voted yes. We're going to say that, in fact, we're giving the same legal standing, the same rights to a frozen mass of tissue, an embryo, that we give to a living child. And in fact, this does apply to what we call in vitro embryos.
And to clarify, this is the Alabama Supreme Court, not the federal Supreme Court.
That's correct. That's correct. And, a lot of people have asked if there is a path to the federal Supreme Court within this case. And I don't want to jump ahead, but, it's on the tip of your tongue to ask. And the truth is, in a very, very slim chance, maybe, but the reality is that these claims are based on interpreting state law. And so there is no clear path for this particular case to make.
Now, there could be others though, right?
But this is yes.
Yeah. With this case, my understanding also though is for those of our friends and acquaintances and colleagues who are in Alabama, it's not that there's necessarily this is a closed door. My understanding is the Alabama state legislature actually can come back and do something about this. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, they have.
Yeah, but it's not so great though, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's tough because, as an organization that cares deeply about the patients that we're serving, it's never easy to say no to something that looks pro-patient, but people are tricky in the legislature. And so it's important to keep an eye on the bigger picture. So what happened in this past week? So right after the ruling was issued, we got word that 3 of the largest clinics in Alabama were pausing treatments because, again, the reality of this ruling was, it has a chilling effect. Docs are afraid, rightfully so, embryologists and others in those labs, of, what does it mean if I drop an embryo? Am I suddenly, liable for that? Fortunately, we know that the criminal statutes, the manslaughter and what have you statutes, don't apply in this instance, but civil liability still stands. And, people are justifiably cautious and worried. And it also, yes. Yeah.
I would also say that, when you're sitting here talking about like somebody dropping an embryo, I think it even goes to something even more basic, that there's fear that if an embryologist saw an embryo and the embryo did not survive the freeze and thaw process, which we all understand is a possible risk
of about roughly 5% or so. So this is not a 0% risk. This happens on a regular basis across the country.
Yeah, or just the normal attrition and development. Not every egg that fertilizes is going to make it to the 5th day. It's going to die along the way. So, are we going to be accused of murder if it's normal attrition?
That's right. And so exactly these questions are percolating, right? And everyone's sort of, thankfully the national lens turned on to this. And the Alabama Supreme Court and others heard an outcry from the community. And, it goes beyond a simple fix of making it clear that people can continue to practice IVF. This is a bigger picture strategy on the part of those that are looking to curtail women's access to reproductive health, individuals' access. And so we saw the abortion, landscape change after Dobbs. And we have to recognize that at the base of this Alabama Supreme Court decision is the concept of personhood, redefining when life begins. And as long as we leave that question unaddressed or to stand as written in this argument or in this decision, we leave the door open. Not only for
Well, sorry, go ahead. I was going to ask a question when you finished that thought.
Yeah, not only for additional personhood legislation at the state level, but also for the federal government to step in and say, based on precedents such as Alabama. Yeah.
And that was what I was going to bring up. I believe, aren't there 5 states that have passed personhood bills? And can you kind of explain kind of what that means?
What is personhood?
What is personhood? What exactly does that mean?
Yeah. Absolutely. So personhood is essentially any law that makes the case or states that a fertilized egg and sperm. So you're the doctors, you're better at speaking this language than I. When you fertilize the egg with the sperm, that's a person. And that is legally protected under the laws of the land, or wherever that law stands. It's at a state level. And that protects, they have all the rights of a person. Whereas the reality is that across the country, we have a patchwork quilt of laws when it comes to this and defining when, life begins. Yes.
So basically the personhood bills are in essence very similar to what the Alabama state law said, or the Alabama court ruling. Basically, the push is always to try and make an embryo equivalent to a person, which right now there's 5 states that have to deal with that as they practice medicine. Absolutely. And as a patient see them.
For our listeners, because we have listeners not only all around the United States, but all around the world, which 5 states currently have personhood bills, and are there states that we are concerned about doing that soon?
I don't have the list off the top of my head. I can say that we keep track of this. We track 50 states' laws across the country on all these things. So if you want to visit asrm.org and view our advocacy activities, we should have summaries of those states. I do know that there are at least 6 states that have protections for providers who are delivering this care, protections. They're called shield laws. So it runs the gambit in terms of whether you're protected explicitly or you're reliant on case law and the like to protect the practice of reproductive medicine at this point, which is why we are fighting really hard at the federal level to get a national codification of a right to access IVF. And that's what we saw this week as well.
What kind of role does ASRM play when things like this are in court before a ruling is made?
Yeah. So we make a decision on a case-by-case basis. The truth is that state courts sometimes don't want to hear from the big national organizations about something happening in their own backyard, right? And so that can be sort of a negative to have our voice coming in. So we made the conscious decision. We were monitoring this case, but we hadn't weighed in any formal way to the Alabama case as it was winding through the courts. When it reached the Supreme Court and we saw this decision, we activated our base, and that includes our attorneys. And we filed together with other organizations, including the Alabama Medical Association, what's called an amicus brief. So it's a friend of the court brief. And this was introduced on Friday. We just dropped it with a motion asking the Supreme Court, to rehear this case. So basically, it's a technical maneuver, and reality says it's maybe a 1% chance of success given the audience, but we had to do it. And so we filed a brief pointing out the scientific fallacies embedded within the majority opinion, the impact that this has across the country, and the importance of really thinking about the consequences of this decision. And so that was filed, as I said, on Friday with a motion for rehearing, and we're awaiting word from the court.
So you're going down that avenue. Do you see anything coming from the Alabama legislature other than I think they just passed a law that really didn't say an embryo wasn't equivalent to a person. They just sort of circumvented it. But do you see anything else happening in Alabama? Because it's really interesting. And for our listeners who don't know, the Office for the American Society for Reproductive Medicine happens to be in Alabama, right?
Yeah, we're headquartered in DC, but we have 30 or so employees there in Birmingham.
So do you see this pressure? Because, interestingly enough, watching on the national news, I was going in to do egg retrievals last Sunday, and I was watching on the national news right before I went in, like how IVF were. I mean, I'm like, I can't believe all this national attention. Yeah. I think it's going to be, I kind of think it's going to be a positive thing because it opens everybody's eyes to this, and the face of our patients and them and having the courage to speak out has made a huge difference. Because when you see young, sweet, healthy women and their partners, and that all they ever want to do is have a baby, and now all of a sudden, because of this ruling, they're stuck in limbo, even more than the usual limbo of what they are when they go through IVF. And so I think that has to have a positive effect on people that are watching that don't know anything about IVF.
100% yes. We are, it's a very unfortunate situation to bring this to the fore, but we are above the fold right now. We are national news, and we need to seize upon this moment. And seeing, our CEO join patient advocates, including our partners at Resolve and other groups, to go to the legislature last week in Mobile and protest and show support for IVF. It's really, it's so, it inspires us every day when we're sitting.
It makes me proud to be part of ASRM. I'm like, I'm part of that organization.
It makes me proud to be part of the, I'm also an IVF mom. So being part of this patient community and being able to say, we're not going to hide and have a taboo around this topic any longer. And I think one of the things that we knew going into this year, because this is what we do for a living and we're sort of, mired in the politics of it all, is that a lot of people just don't get it. They don't understand what IVF is. They don't understand the science behind it. Why on earth would you have extra embryos? Why this? Why that? This is our moment as experts, as patients, to teach and say, among other things, first, don't legislate when you don't know the medical facts. Call us, talk to the experts. Should be obvious. And also listen to the patients and recognize that this isn't a they problem. This is a, 1 in 6 Americans deal with infertility. In my case, for instance, it was my husband who was infertile. This is not a women's issue. This is not a, straight women's issue. This is everybody being impacted. These are people who have, iatrogenic infertility or caused by things like chemotherapy. Don't they have a right to a family? What about the members of our military who are deploying and putting their own fertility and family building on hold and at risk? Don't they have a right to coverage? And so this is an all-out effort across the board to make sure every single member of the society has access to the very fundamental and basic right to build the family that they want.
To help put some of the science into perspective here, there's a huge amount of attrition that happens between in IVF when you're talking about an egg retrieval, from the number of eggs that are grown and seen in the ovaries on ultrasound to the number of live births that will actually come from that. Even if you have a really good egg donor, you may still only get 1 or 2 live births out of that, depending on what else is happening. So it's not like 20 eggs equals 20 embryos equals 20 children.
Carrie,
so that's
can you break that process of attrition down just real briefly so that some of our newer listeners maybe can get a little more familiar with that?
So when we are looking at an IVF cycle, there is a funnel effect. We give medications to grow the eggs, the follicles grow, and we do a procedure called an egg retrieval to take them out. The embryologist assess which ones are mature, because only the mature ones are usable, and not every egg is going to be mature. They then fertilize them. Not every egg is going to fertilize, despite the fact that all of us would dearly love for each and every one to be mature and to fertilize. And then not every embryo is going to become not every fertilized egg is going to become a viable embryo. And what I mean by that is it's not just the actual presence of what looks like an embryo under a low power microscope. You have to have 2 very important internal structures called the trophectoderm and the inner cell mass that ultimately become the placenta in the baby in order for that embryo to even have a chance of implanting. Even in the best case scenario, not all of those embryos are going to implant, because not all of them will contain the correct number of chromosomes, which is something we can identify on pre-implantation genetic testing. And even the ones where everything looks stellar, the lining of the uterus, the embryo, everything goes perfectly, right now, the most consistent rates that we're seeing are about 70% success rate. And that's in an ideal, perfect patient. That doesn't even begin to consider when you've got somebody in their 40s or with some severe fertility factor. And so these embryos, you may have 100 embryos in storage, and in a perfect world, you're only going to get 70 babies out of that. And this is very much not a perfect world, and you're probably not going to get 70 babies out of that. The other thing to consider is the natural fertility course, where when you have a woman who is not on contraception, so she's not preventing pregnancy at all, when she releases an egg, there's actually a pretty decent chance that it will fertilize. However, the better part of 50% of those fertilized eggs that occur in the body will never make it to a baby, because most of them are never even going to make it to the point where the woman even knows that she's pregnant, because it starts and then fails well before there is any sign of a positive pregnancy test. And so when we're talking about these issues with making embryos real people, and forgive me for rambling on, but the very real questions that we need to consider are, if that embryo in a tank is considered to be a child, what happens down the line? And practical matters are, what happens if those parents lose their insurance and now the child has to be taken care of by Medicaid? Does the state then pay the embryology lab and the embryologist for maintaining those tanks? What happens if those parents die in a car accident and they don't have a will? Next of kin is typically children. So does a third of their estate go to each of those 3 embryos? And who manages that and who pays for that? What happens if the embryologist accidentally drops a dish? This does not happen very often. I've been doing this for 15 years. I have yet to see an embryologist drop a dish. But do they then go to jail because this is a mass murder event? What happens when a woman forgets a progesterone injection and she doesn't get pregnant? Is that a manslaughter charge ultimately? And what happens if there is faulty media that affects multiple embryos? Is that genocide? And then when you start to think about some of the other practical issues, such as, if 50% of women who are not on birth control get pregnant and those pregnancies don't continue, does that mean that every single cycle that a woman who's not taking birth control has a period, she should be issued both a birth and a death certificate? I mean, I can keep going for a while, but
you're going, Carrie. Just keep going.
So all of these are very real issues. And none of this has anything to do with theology. None of this has anything to do with personal beliefs. This is just the straight numbers of the situation. And so, does every embryo transfer that doesn't stick, every embryo that gets thawed that may not survive or that doesn't become a pregnancy, where are those birth and death certificates? And do those people get additional rights as a result of that you normally see with bereavement or with maternity rights? This means that, all right, maybe there should be maternity laws for absolutely everybody going through fertility treatment, because this is considered a child and they should have support, from taxes to laws to time off to insurance. I mean, you start going down this road, like it is a bumpy.
Do you have a JD
for you?
I know.
You need a JD degree, Carrie.
I have thought about it before, but talk to my in-laws about that. They'll support you with that.
So, Becca, for our listeners who are stressed and worried, who are in Alabama or outside of Alabama, because I can tell you, I'm pretty sure the stress level is just as high outside of those state lines as it is inside.
Our state touches Alabama, and I have an Alabama license, so I'm worried.
Right. For our listeners, what are 2 or 3 things that you think are important for them to do and or keep in mind?
Absolutely. First of all, stay loud. If you feel comfortable sharing your story and amplifying this message of IVF is healthcare and it's pro-family, then use your voice. And there are many ways you can do that. One is coming up on May 14th. We have ASRM and Resolve host a federal virtual advocacy day. You can go to resolve.org to register and be part of the sea of people that are going to be meeting with their members of Congress to talk about these issues. There are also state convenings, as we know, where you can be present, but also just, if you are a constituent of someone, they represent you, go to their local office and ask them where they stand on these issues. Reach out to them, tweet at them, or whatever it's called now, reach out and get to know them. If you're a physician and you're concerned, invite them to come see your practice and hear about the work that you're doing and why it matters. Because the more human we make an issue, the more likely people pay attention, right? Yeah.
I want to piggyback on that. Fertility patients are not the best patients after they have completed their fertility journey at being advocates for others, because we're happy, we're moving on, we're living our lives with our children, and it's great. And it's one of the things that kind of separates the fertility world from other health issues, like cancer survivors, heart disease survivors, different things like this. I absolutely say this is the time to open your door and be a voice, because your voice is so valuable in letting people know and understand that story of what we help become realities.
Absolutely. And I can affirm that as a former state Senate employee and staffer, where the meetings I listen to, lobbyists are fine. I'm a recovering lobbyist myself. But the meetings we listen to are the real people that share their stories. So everybody has their own comfort zone. Do what you're comfortable with. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll tell you too, we had probably about 8 years ago, and it was well before your time, Becca, but we had a personhood bill that was coming up in the state legislature in Tennessee. And at the time, all the REIs in the state got together on a conference call. It was before Zoom. And basically what we heard was, you just need to flood all the senators with letters. And what we've also heard from somebody that we have a real strong connection with somebody in the state Senate, that use a lot of bills that come up through the Senate don't get a lot of attention and nobody pays. But if there's a bill that gets a lot of attention and they start seeing a strong positive reaction or a strong negative reaction, that makes a big difference for
Absolutely.
the bills.
They log those calls. They keep track of that. And I have been approved by my senator boss saying, how many calls did we get on this? So
makes a big difference.
And I know we're in a world where a lot of our people don't like to actually make phone calls. You can go on their websites and you can click a button,
email them.
You can send a message directly to your representatives without having to verbally say anything, and you can send an email. That voice is just as important.
Well, and I don't think
I'm sorry. Follow Instagram on social media. We do action alerts. Whenever there is something happening in your state that we feel like it's time to launch an advocacy alert, that means it's all hands on deck and we need your voices. So in the wake of the Alabama ruling, we had people respond to our advocacy alert in record numbers. We had more people engaged than ever before out of our membership, and had all 50 states engaged in sending messages. And look at us now. Last week we were at the White House to talk about this with leaders in the Women's Policy Council. We have, Gender Policy Council. We had folks up on Capitol Hill for hearings on these issues. We're helping, the other thing that you can do is, when these bills come up, it's not just a matter of an email or tweet. We need people to testify and to share their story more formally. Now, if you're available to do that and interested, we may reach out to you. And the more people we know that are interested in sharing their story, the better. So one thing that we have on our website is a form where you can do that. You can let us know, hey, use me, share my story. This is my background. I'm a provider and this is what I see, or whatever it is. Because, at this moment, we can't afford to take the foot off the gas. We've got to keep going.
Well, very good. Any last questions, or Rebecca, any last comments from you?
Just that I am so honored and grateful to be part of this community and to work with passionate people such as you who get it and just are relentlessly advocates for the community and for their patients, because I wouldn't be a mom if not for this. And it's an honor to be able to, fight for others' right to have that joy. But also recognize that this is not a one and done situation. This is not going to be quickly resolved. We are in a battle nationally that began with the Dobbs decision and well before that, frankly. And it's a bigger conversation than only IVF. So make sure that you're paying attention to the big headlines. There's a reason why we stood back and said, we want to support opening those clinics in Alabama. We want to support legislation that does that, but you got to go further, because that law will become rubber stamped in other states that are paying attention. So let's all just stay unified in our shared goal of making sure that anyone who needs it has access to fertility care.
Thank
Well
you.
said. Well, Becca, we really appreciate you coming on. I emailed you, and I think you emailed me back the very next day, and I was like almost shocked that it was that
Those are
you
amazing, of
agreed
course.
so quickly to talk to us. We really appreciate it. And to our audience, thanks for listening, and tune in next week for more. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review in iTunes. We'd love to hear from you, and you can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook.
You can also visit fertilitydocsuncensored.com to submit specific questions you have about infertility. All questions will be answered on the podcast anonymously for our Ask the Doc segment, so don't hold back. We love episode ideas. Let us know what you're thinking and what you want to hear.
As always, this podcast is intended for entertainment and is not a substitute for medical advice from your own physician. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.